You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 378 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. The most important thing to talk about on today's show is the increasing tensions in the Persian Gulf as Iran has now responded to the United Kingdom by seizing a UK ship in the Strait of Hormuz. I also have some news today on the F-35 and Turkey making some threats about Syria. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. The best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where the show and my daily news roundup are featured in the right-hand column of the homepage. Once you've listened to a few shows and like it, make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. Remember, it is on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed, alongside the Scott Horton Show and Liberty Weekly podcast. And the show has its own feed on YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, any podcast app, and while you're there, give it a rating and review. Last, if you want to donate to the show and get in on the monthly live stream, we're doing that in a couple days here, July 24th, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. I will have an hour where you could join the stream and, ask me questions and talk to me there, or you could post questions either in the Facebook group and the Patreon page, and I will answer those. So think about donating $5 a month at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus for that. All right, now to news. The F-35, of course, another problem, which I feel like there's probably a show's worth of material of me just doing these small little stories of another problem with the F-35. This time it's the canopy, and I guess they don't have whatever coating they need to put on the canopy to make it safe and stealth. And so this is going to hurt the combat readiness and just another obstacle to the F-35 project, which of course, where it's big in the news right now is around Turkey, and we'll get into that more later. But just quickly, I read a number here that says kicking Turkey out of the F-35 program, which the U.S. is doing because Turkey elected to buy the S-400 air defense system from Russia. The counterpart to that would be the Patriot missile system, I believe made by Raytheon in the United States. And so, as you could imagine, a major U.S. weapons maker losing out on a massive contract. I think Turkey ended up paying about $2.5 billion, and who knows how much long-term cost they're going to end up paying Russia for this missile system. But at least for now, they've already paid about $2.5 million. So, Raytheon's pretty upset that they didn't get, I think they were even going to get a bigger chunk for the Patriot missile system because it's more expensive, that, they lost out on this contract with Turkey. So, of course, they're upset about that. And then the military has at least drawn this line, and from a lot of people that I've read, I think it's more or less true that having the S-400 system and the F-35 and the S-400 being able to collect all that data on the F-35 will make it really, strategically vulnerable to that air defense system, which is, of course, Russian. And so with the grand idea of the F-35 being something, a fifth generation stealth fighter to use against China and Russia, if the Russians have a, strategic advantage against the F-35, that's something the U.S. would look to prevent. Anyways, this is a hell of a complicated thing. Just like the F-35 is built in just about every U.S. state, parts of it were actually planned to be built in Turkey. I've heard cockpit parts and landing gear. I'm not sure exactly, what it is for any of this, but some of these parts are important and have to be made. And so shifting that production over to the United States going to cost $500 to $600 million is the current estimate. And while this may seem like a drop in the bucket compared to the $750 billion, the Defense Department, which, really should be the War Department, is going to get in 2020, just as their baseline spending, that's not going to count the, slush fund of the overseas contingency operations. The VA, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, CIA, all have separate budgets. And so $500 million isn't really anything compared to $750 billion. But if you think about it, I would take just $1 million of those $5 million or $500 million, and that would drastically change my life. I mean, even divide that money up among 5,000, 10,000 people, and it's hugely important to them. And yet, this is now just going to be thrown away because for some reason we initially decided to include Turkey in on this F-35 project. For now, I'm going to move on, but towards the end of the show where I'm talking about Syria, I will circle back a little bit to this subject to talk about what's going on in northern Syria and Turkey's threat of invasion. On U.S. aircraft in the Middle East, apparently all the F-22s have been rotated out, and now there's F-15s in place. I'm not quite sure if this counts the Afghan theater, where I know they've been using a lot of F-22s for the bombing of drug labs in Afghanistan. While that mission may have finally ended, I would assume they, were using the F-22s for just the basic bombing of the Taliban and ISIS targets or whoever they allege is a militant over there. And the reason for this is the Pentagon has this really bad rate of F-22 preparedness. I think a lot of times it's under like 50% of these aircraft are actually able to, fly at any given time. This plane, like the F-35, has faced problems with, the mechanics cannibalizing them. They have to start taking parts out of some planes and putting them into other planes just so they could keep a couple of the planes in the air. But of course then, now you have several planes that don't have any parts in them at all and are very far from being combat ready. So I guess they figure rotating them out of service and putting them on the shelf is going to allow them time to work on more of them, and then they could get the combat readiness up for all the F-22s. Of course, this is only going to be because they're not using them. The head of the IAEA has died, apparently from some kind of illness. It's very hush-hush at this point. On the last show, I had said that he had announced for health reasons he was planning on resigning in March of next year. So this is going to accelerate some of the, events I was talking about happening on the last show. Like, this is a very important position if you're looking at it's going to, monitor if the Iran nuclear deal is able to be saved. This will be the organization carrying out the inspecting and everything. So it's important to have honest people in charge of that will give real answers. Imagine if somebody's, very politically biased and maybe appointed by like a Bolton or Benjamin Netanyahu. Not that either of those men had the power to appoint the head of the IAEA. But we know that, these are countries and people like Bolton who really look to influence these international organizations to get the reports out they need for their wars. So if Bolton does get somebody in charge of that group who's maybe willing to look the other way on some report or, put some misleading adjectives in there to demonize Iran, it could be really destructive and really dangerous. So even though it seems like a really unimportant thing who heads the IAEA, it is going to be important to kind of make sure the U.S. isn't doing too much to manipulate the selection process here. Ukraine's President Zelensky called for snap elections after being elected as president. So this is a country with a president and a parliamentary. And after he was elected president, he called for elections of the parliamentary. And apparently his party has done very well, capturing a majority of the seats. This will be the first time, I believe, in Ukrainian history since, before they were part of the USSR, that the president's party has had a majority in the parliament. And so they're saying that this guy has a lot of room to get stuff done. Now, there was some fear when he was running that he was, quote unquote, pro-Russian, whatever exactly that would mean in this situation. Like, if a president said, I want to improve relationships with Canada, would they then be a pro-Canadian president? I don't know, because this is what we're talking about here. Russia's the country next door. Now, Zelensky had talked about wanting to bring an end to the war in the Donbass region of Ukraine. However, he still, kind of expressed the desire to join the EU, and it seems that Ukraine is really on a path to that. More destructive, he has expressed a willingness to join NATO, although says that that would be up to a popular referendum. So I will keep my eye on Ukraine, especially when it comes to Ukraine making decisions around joining the EU, joining NATO, trying to end the civil war, or whatever's going on with the Crimean Peninsula. Will the Ukrainian government admit that that has been taken back by Russia and kind of concede that, or if they will continue to push that Russia needs to give that territory back to Ukraine, which seems extremely unlikely. I think Zelensky's in a terribly difficult position here. He's kind of stuck between two world superpowers in a country that has an ongoing civil war and a terrible history of corruption. I'm sure a lot of that is due to the fact that it was part of the USSR, one of the worst and most corrupt governments on the face of the planet. Remember, this is the guy, though, that played I believe, history teacher that ends up kind of accidentally getting elected president of Ukraine in a sitcom, and then being like this, I think nicer, just honest guy that goes to work and tries to do good for people. And so, in a government like Ukraine's that has so much corruption and so many ongoing problems, he maybe could be a source of stability, but I don't want to be too optimistic about anything. Sam Biddle has a very good article at The Intercept that I'll link to in the show notes page, and I guess there's nothing in it that's particularly technological in this article, even though it is about AI, but he explains this whole AI problem in a very interesting way. First of all, I think he does kind of take the time to say like, hey, we are calling any advanced algorithm AI at this point, and so for me, the visions of like a TV or a movie like iRobot really aren't the case when they're talking about this. But everybody's freaking out that, America's falling behind in tech and AI to China. And, this is equivalent to the, next space race. And we got to do something here to get ahead of China. And then Biddle points out that they also say, oh my God, look at what China's doing with their internal credit system and their facial recognition software and all this other terrible stuff they're doing with their AI. He's like, hey, wait a second. You're saying that we're falling behind China in AI, but China is using it for suppression of their own population. So if the government starts to develop their own AI, then won't that be for the suppression of the American population? Why would we want to spend a whole bunch of money on that? And the whole way he frames is very good and important, because I think a lot of us maybe stay out of the AI conversation just because it's hard to understand exactly what people mean when they say AI and why falling behind in it would be bad, and all the, I'm sure, awful things the U.S. and Chinese governments will do to connect AI and their nuclear arsenals. But at the same time, there's no clear argument as to why the U.S. has to get in this race and why it would be bad if we lose. Or, one thing that I think is unfortunate that he doesn't talk about is saying that, hey, like, if the government isn't spending money on this, then it's probably not going to be spent on the military. And the Pentagon's not offering contracts to companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon, then this, AI software is only going to go into things that, improve the lives of people and make their experiences either. People like Amazon because it's awesome. They bring stuff to your door really cheap and really quick. And there's a lot of other non-government involved private sector AI use that's really fantastic, and it's going to be really great and make all of our lives a lot better. But if we spend all of our time, investing just on the military side of it and on the government side of it, then we're going to get, systems of war and systems of oppression. There's a growing rift in the trade relationship between South Korea and Japan. Of course, these two countries, while American allies, and often said in the same sense as American allies so frequently, it gives the impression that they're like the UK and France, when in reality, there's a really complicated legacy of Japanese oppression, especially leading up to and during World War II, of the Korean people. This includes South Koreans, as far as I think using them for slave labor, some scientific experiments, and stealing the women as set slaves. So a really terrible thing happened there. And Japan has paid war reparations, I know, in the past to both South Korea and China for the crimes committed by, the government back then. But now a South Korean court ruled that Japan companies that use this labor now owe restitution. I don't know enough about the situation to actually weigh in on the justice of this ruling. Is it fair to hold these companies accountable? How much were they involved in what was going on? Did they really profit off of it? And, since then, have they paid? I guess, maybe in the past they paid. Either way, this caused, I think, Japan to cut some of the imports that they give to South Korea. Of course, Japan said, well, it has nothing to do with the court ruling, but everybody assumed it had to do with the court ruling. And so I don't think there's been official retaliation like from the South Korean government, but there has been notice from the South Korean people as far as they're not buying a lot of Japanese beer and other Japanese products. And if you look at the article, and I'll link to it in the show notes page where people will want to know more about this, but there's been meaningful cuts in the amount of sales I believe Japanese clothing companies and beer companies are actually making in South Korea because of this dispute. There also seems to be, a little bit of a rift between South Korea and Japan on what they would like as far as the North Korea outcome to be. Japan and Abe seem far more hawkish. Of course, Abe, the leader of Japan right now, is working to amend the Japanese constitution that was put in place after World War II. That is known as a pacifist constitution that really prevents Japan from doing anything militarily outside of its own borders. Now, I mean, we have a constitution in the United States of America that says the president can't go to war without a declaration of war. So I'm no fool to think that, this has probably been seen to since World War II, that Japan has never intervened in anything outside of its own borders. Now it seems Abe is looking to maybe cement some of the stuff he's got away with in law, so I'm sure they're going to become even more aggressive overseas. And the South Korean government, especially under Moon Jae-in, has had no real policy with North Korea other than, let's get some kind of deal done. Let's improve relations. Let's, reestablish economic trade on the Korean Peninsula. How fantastic that would be. All right, here we go with the big news. Iran has seized a UK tanker. Gone linked to an article by Moon of Alabama for anybody who wants the breakdown and all the technical analysis, the weights of the ships, what they were carrying. He's got maps in there, the exact kind of transponder path. But what it seems like happened is a UK ship was sailing through the Strait of Hormuz. It was approached by some Iranian vessels. It attempted to redirect course to Oman to escape the Iranian ships. A helicopter with some Iranian forces actually roped down onto the ship, seized control, and turned the ship back towards an Iranian port, and is now being held by Iran. Now, people, who just see this say, oh my God, what terrible aggression. I can't believe how reckless and terrible the Iranians are. Man, that John Bolton, that Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, all right, that country is just full of people who are looking to mess up the world. When in reality, what happened is a couple weeks ago, an Iranian ship, the Grace 1, it was a super tanker, was too big apparently to fit through the Suez Canal, so it sailed around Africa and into the Mediterranean Sea to bring oil allegedly to Syria. Now, Iran has said that oil was going somewhere else but never specified. I don't know where it was going, but I know it didn't get there, and that is because there's a small UK enclave, Gibraltar, that is on the south of Spain, that I don't think Spain even really recognizes, but the UK does. And they say, this ship crossed into our territorial waters there and we seized it. Now, we do have some bad story on this, and apparently John Bolton, according to a Spanish newspaper, actually traveled to the UK to bring the government this intelligence. And then the decision was still made by the UK government, so they are to blame. This isn't, a situation where it's all Bolton's fault. But apparently Bolton used this information to get the reaction he wanted out of the British government, and that is to escalate tensions between the UK and Iran by the UK seizing this ship. So that tanker is held. They just announced they're going to hold it for another month. And weeks later, Iran now steals a UK ship in response. I think if you look at the history of especially recent history of Iranian actions, it's pretty consistent that they respond to, acts of aggression against them. And so the UK stealing the Iranian ship means that the UK should have expected in this case that Iran was going to steal a UK ship. And, maybe they're open to, hey, everybody releases everybody at the same time. But those looking for a diplomatic solution here will still have to contend with the Hawks in the Trump administration, who are going to look to just use this event to increase tension. So now that the UK leadership has drug its country deeper into this whole mess with Iran, and some of it has probably been unwilling because the US let the deal, my guess is that if the UK could have it their way, they would have preferred to just leave things as is. However, they haven't done a whole lot to actually stand up to the US here, reimposing sanctions on Iran. And with the stealing of the ship, again, really put themselves in a hole here, and may not even have the Navy capabilities to escort all of their cargo ships through the Strait of Hormuz. And the U.S. is absolutely failing in their attempt to put together a coalition to protect shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. As far as the reporting goes, most countries are saying, we haven't been formally asked, so we don't have to answer that question. Countries that have been asked have said, no, we don't want to be dragged deeper and are afraid of getting into some kind of shooting war with Iran. A lot of the other countries either don't have navies capable of helping, or some of the Arab countries aren't even interested in getting involved here. I've even seen reports that the UAE is maybe walking this back and taking steps back with the tensions with Iran. So that's the situation in the Gulf. Again, it's quite a mess, and things are only getting messier by the day. The U.S. is apparently adding some troops to Saudi Arabia. Of course, this is the thing that really got the ball rolling, is the U.S. deployment of troops in Saudi Arabia, cited by Osama bin Laden as one of his reasons for waging war against America. Leads to 9/11, and here we are drawn into forever wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, now Syria, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, etc. I did want to just mention here that there's been a whole lot of reporting going on that I think is just unconfirmed and probably not true. One of those is that Iran had seized a second ship, but apparently it was just in need of a tow and was towed to Iran, and there was no further problems with it. And then another ship was confronted by Iran, but this ship had actually drifted into Iranian waters, and normal procedures and protocol were done, with Iran just escorting that ship, I guess, back into a shipping lane and giving some kind of warning not to do it again. There's been reports and claims by the United States that they shot down an Iranian drone. President Trump even went as far as to ensure that this happened. Iran denies it. It seems odd to me that the U.S. wouldn't produce some kind of video footage of this if it actually happened, but maybe it's just going through a classification process and we'll see it soon. Iran has something of a drone program, so I don't know if it would be devastating if the U.S. did shoot one down anyways, or maybe they didn't shoot down an Iranian drone. Maybe they only thought it was. I'm sure, especially with the ongoing tensions in the Gulf right now, there's probably a lot more stuff flying around as far as like surveillance drones goes than usual, and accidents happen from time to time. So just don't leave open any possibilities there. Maybe the U.S. shot down a drone. Maybe they already fired a missile. I also read reports that it wasn't shot down, that its signal was just jammed, and that's what downed it. Iran has claimed that they captured 17, I believe, CIA-linked U.S. spies. The U.S. has came out and denied this. I suspect that the U.S. would deny it even if it actually happened, but it seems unlikely to me, I guess, that Iran got 17 U.S. spies at one time, especially if, we're thinking CIA spies like, white boys trained in Langley. It may be that they just captured like 18 members of the MEK or something like that were operating in Iran. Last on today's show, I have some news on Syria. There is fighting going on in the Idlib province of Syria. This is northern region that borders Turkey, and this is held by the Al-Qaeda-backed forces. Syria is using airstrikes there, and like with the rest of the war, this is causing civilian deaths. We have reports from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is definitely a rebel-friendly organization, reporting several Syrian airstrikes have killed dozens of civilians in the past week or so. There's no reason to believe this isn't true, or that the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights may be inflating the number somewhat. They also blame Russia for some of those airstrikes, although I haven't seen any confirmation that, Russia is at this point actually using their bombers in Idlib. Next to the Idlib province is Afrin, Syria, and this is a region that was once a Turkish enclave, however was invaded and I believe is now occupied by Turkish forces and Turkish-backed rebel groups. And then if you continue along the Turkish border in the northern Aleppo province of Syria, here you have Turkish-friendly and Turkish-backed Syrian rebels. This is part of the Euphrates Shield operation that Turkey started a few years ago to prevent U.S.-backed YPG, which is the Syrian Kurds, from pushing too far west in Syria. And they control the region not quite all the way to the Euphrates River, but up until the outskirts of Manbij, which is now a Kurdish-held city that Turkey demands be turned over to their backed Euphrates Shield forces. A deal was made last summer to have that done. The U.S. seemed to agree to it, and as far as I could tell, the Kurds just didn't leave. Some of the leaders of different organizations may have, but apparently it's still all Syrian Kurdish-controlled government and security operations in that city. My guess is that the Americans are probably still there too, or some kind of international forces keeping Turkey from just outright invading that city, which they have threatened to do. Turkey also has an issue with the rest of the border east of the Euphrates River that Turkey shares with Syria. This is all YPG, Syrian Kurd-controlled land backed by the United States. Most of it, I think, is long-standing kind of like Kurdish territory, but a lot of it at one point was seized by the Islamic State. U.S.-backed bombs helped drive out the ISIS fighters, of course, destroying a lot of cities and killing a lot of people along the way. So now the Syrian control that. They're asking for, I think, like a 20 or 30 mile buffer zone that their forces would control inside of Syria. So far, the Syrian Kurds and the U.S. have rejected this, but Turkey is now threatening to just straight up invade. Now, what this has to do and how this all plays in geopolitics between Turkey's interests in North Cyprus, the issues with the U.S. threatening sanctions against Turkey. If the U.S. sanctions Turkey, will Turkey then, up threats or even start an invasion in northern Syria? Or would even the EU be an option? There's, 50 or so nuclear weapons that the U.S. has at the Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. Will we have to relocate those? There's a whole bunch of questions. And I guess as far as it goes, sitting here in the United States of America, for me right now, not being a close advisor of the Turkish President Erdogan, it's really hard to know how Turkey weighs everything and what kind of actions that they will end up taking here. But, that is the threat. And of course, if Turkey does put their troops into Syrian territory, I think that just probably prolongs the Syrian civil war, which hopefully will wrap up sometime in the next year or so. All right, that's it for the show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. The show is also on checkpointasia.net. My show, along with a bunch of other great content. The editor there is Marko Marjanovic, past guest of the show, great guy. Make sure you check out his website at KYAAALE on Twitter. The private Facebook group is just called Foreign Policy Focus. Request to join if you want to. Patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus. If you listen to the show on a podcast or YouTube or something, do what you can. Like it, rating and review, subscribe. I don't know what other options are on all the different things, but do all that, and I really appreciate it, and I'll be back next time.